Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Living in Switzerland. The series is brought to you by Rütli. We are a staffing and project services company based in Zurich. If you or anyone you know of is looking for a new role in Switzerland, or if you're looking to hire, let us know. We'd be happy to help. The best way to do that is by going to rigby.ch/apply and filling out the form. Then, if we have anything that might be of interest, we'll gladly let you know.
Well, hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the Expert Guide to Your Life in Switzerland. This is Daniel from Rütli. We're a staffing and IT services company based in Zurich.
And I'm Diccon. I live in Bern and I write far too many books about Switzerland.
We are two Brits who both moved to Switzerland around the same time in 2005. In this series, we'll be talking about what we've learned about the country since then and about some of our experiences of living here. In today's episode, we'll be talking about Swiss history.
Yeah, I know that sounds about as interesting as watching paint dry, but really it isn't. It's actually quite fascinating, and especially at the speed we're going to go at. We're going to cover 730 years in around half an hour.
All right, let's get started with the answer to last month's quiz question, which was what happened at the Rütli meadow?
Which is actually a great place to start because it's where Switzerland was born. So a long way back on the 1st of August 1291, men from the three cantons met in a meadow beside Lake Lucerne, and they swore an oath of allegiance. Their main aim was really a mutual defense pact against the Habsburgs, who are now called the Austrians, who were the eternal enemy of the Swiss. But there's a but.
Of course, this is Switzerland after all.
And this but is a really big but. But no one is certain it ever happened, at least not there and then. The Rütli Pact was one of a few made around the end of the 13th century, but there's no actual proof that it happened on that date, who was present, or even if it took place in that famous meadow. But that aside, there are important facts that are known. The first three cantons were Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden, and Unterwalden these days is split into Nidwalden and Obwalden. There was a pact that was signed, and you can see that in the Bundesbrief Museum in Schwyz, and it is really worth a visit. It's quite a small museum, but it's really interesting. And if you've seen the Tell play, which is on every summer in Interlaken, it would have you believe that William Tell was there. But of course, he wasn't there. He wasn't involved at all because he never existed. So, Daniel, have you been to Rütli?
Actually, I haven't yet. Would you recommend it?
I actually really like it. There's not much there. Is a meadow, which is where the event took place, and a flag. And that's about it, really. It's not America, so there's no national park. The best part for me is that to get there, you can only go by boat or on foot. So that makes it quite a worthwhile journey, something to remember.
Yeah, I think you could say that Switzerland had quite a peaceful birth compared to many other countries there at Rütli. But the fighting came soon after, of course.
Yes, of course, this was the 13th century. People weren't going to do things without fighting. There wasn't much in 1291, but it didn't take long. So the Habsburgs weren't about to let these Swiss upstarts upset everything. And the Swiss had to fight for their survival, and fight they did. So the first big battle came in 1315. And that was a huge victory for the Swiss, even though they were outnumbered. It was at Morgarten, and it gave them a real chance for survival. And then the next huge battle, again, another victory over the Habsburgs, was 1386 in Sempach. And that the Swiss won thanks to the heroic sacrifice of a guy called Arnold von Winkelried, great name. Sadly, he never died because he never lived.
Yes, it's another example of a hero who wasn't real.
And that's actually a really interesting point for me about Swiss history. Even the symbol of the country, Helvetia, this sort of Britannia-like figure in armor, is fictional. And perhaps the Swiss don't hero worship real figures. You don't see many statues here. It's not like Britain or America. So they need the made-up heroes instead.
Mm-hmm. And by this point, after defeating the Habsburgs twice, the Swiss had earned a reputation as fearsome fighters. This wasn't the end of the fighting, though.
No, of course not, sadly. They did have a few more victories. So they defeated the Burgundians 3 times in the space of a few years, and against the Holy Roman Empire. And I think what we forget these days, because Switzerland's so peaceful, is that in medieval times, Switzerland was like any other country fighting, but they also became a really formidable army, and they even hired out their men as mercenaries to earn money. And the last remnant of that practice is the Pope's Swiss Guard.
Yes, the Swiss Guard. Now, this doesn't sound much like the generally peaceful Switzerland that tends to keep out of conflict today.
Not at all. They were pretty much like any other European power. They fighting, conquering, pillaging against their neighbors, against each other. And then they were defeated and changed course, not immediately, but it was sort of like this turning point. In 1515, at the Battle of Marignano, which is in northern Italy, they were defeated by the French quite severely. And it's seen as the beginning of Swiss neutrality. It took time. There were other battles afterwards, but this is the point when the Swiss sort of stopped conquering and sort of became more peaceful. And then, of course, the big thing was the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. The Swiss were not involved at all, even though they were split between Catholics and Protestants, just like the rest of Europe. And the treaty that ended that war, the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, recognized Swiss independence for the first time properly. And then the big guarantee of Swiss neutrality came in 1815 with the Congress of Vienna, and it's been respected ever since.
And neutrality for Switzerland doesn't mean that there's no army. Military service is compulsory here, in fact.
Yes, but only for men. It's one of those sort of hangovers of when Switzerland was a patriarchal society. Women don't have to do military service, nor do foreigners, actually, which is one bonus of not having many rights here, is you don't have to be in the army. But Swiss neutrality is definitely armed neutrality. Men have to do military service, and the army is quite well fortified, and there are Swiss arms manufacturers who trade with other countries.
So not entirely pacifist then?
Not in the pure sense, no. It sometimes feels to me as if the Swiss have spent their whole lives preparing for the next invasion, which luckily for them hasn't happened for a few years. But of course, we have to remember they do also act as mediators in many conflicts, so they are neutral and pacifist in that sense.
Yes, that's true, of course.
And now it's time for Swiss Fact of the Month.
Yes, which is that the 1st of August is celebrated as Swiss National Day, but it only became a public holiday in 1994 after the people voted yes to a popular initiative.
And if you want to know what a popular initiative is, then you need to tune in to our podcast from last month when we explain everything about direct democracy.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that's interesting to know is the role that Napoleon played in Swiss history. Could you say a bit about that, Diccon?
Yes, I mean, I didn't know him personally. I'm not that old. But he was the guy who invaded most of Europe, and that included Switzerland. So this happened in 1798. The French invaded under the pretext of freeing what is now Canton Vaud from Bernese rule, so a French-speaking part of the country that was being ruled by German speakers. And Swiss resistance crumbled very, very quickly. And the French occupied the whole country and set up a military headquarters in Bern. Now, it wasn't a great time for Switzerland. They became a battlefield, literally. So the Austrians and the Russians were fighting the French outside the walls of Zurich and up on the Gotthard Pass. And also the French imposed a new country. So the old confederation was abolished and this central state came into being. It was called the Helvetic Republic. There were brand new cantons, such as Sentis, which was St. Gallen and the Appenzels squashed together. But it was the very first time there had been a state that was recognizable as a central state of Switzerland, even though it was called the Helvetic Republic.
Right, and the Helvetic Republic really was the first central state, even though Switzerland had existed since 1291, because at that time the Swiss Confederation was a kind of loose alliance of the cantons plus all of their allies and territories and colonies. So not colonies abroad, but rather regions like Ticino.
They'll love you for saying that.
Oh no, we love our buddies down there in Ticino. But at that time there was no central government or currency or flag or even a capital.
Yeah, it's hard for us to imagine how a country can exist like that, but those were different times. But all of that was swept away in 1798 and replaced with this Helvetic Republic, which wasn't popular. The Swiss don't like central government at all, really. It only lasted 5 years, and that's when Napoleon stepped in. So he abolished it and replaced it with a revamped form of the old confederation. It was called the mediation, and that in turn disappeared when Napoleon did in 1815, and the French were kicked out. So the Swiss got their independence back. They went back to a confederation, albeit this time there were 22 equal cantons, so no more allies and territories and colonies. They were all equal and all self-governing.
Yes, and that's more like the Switzerland that we have today, except for the federal government.
Yeah, and that's a big exception. That didn't appear until 1848, and only after a civil war forced the Swiss to rethink the confederation.
Right, the Swiss had a civil war in the 19th century.
Yes, another impossible to believe fact that the Swiss were still fighting each other in the 19th century, but this was a very civil war. It only lasted a month. It started in November 1847, and 7 Catholic cantons seceded from the Confederation and set up what was called a Sonderbund, or a special league. That's why it's called the Sonderbund War. The Protestant cantons created a federal army under General Dufour, and it was quite an easy victory. It really was over by Christmas. So a month of fighting, 93 dead, and the last ever battle on Swiss soil was at Diccon in Canton Lucerne. And a couple of really important things came out of that war. One is the Swiss flag. So up until that point, there hadn't been the famous Swiss flag, the white cross on the red background. So the Helvetic Republic had a strange tricolor. And then the cantons went back to their own flags. But General Dufour wanted a battle flag for the federal forces, so that became the battle flag, and then in turn it became the Swiss flag. And an even bigger result was a new country. So a federation with a written constitution, federal government and parliament in Bern, but still with the old name, Swiss Confederation.
Yes, and that's much closer, by and large, to the setup that we have in Switzerland today.
Yes, exactly. The constitution has been renewed twice since then, but it's still roughly the same. And the only big change was in 1978-79 when Jura became the last canton. But essentially, the Switzerland we have today, especially the political Switzerland, was created in 1848. And that's why if you visit Parliament in Bern, on one side of the front of the building is the date 1291, and we now know what happened then. And on the other side is 1848.
Okay, well, it's probably time that we moved on now into the 20th century and World War I. Otherwise, it will feel like we've been here the whole 730 years.
Yes, possibly. And also, not a lot happened in the late 19th century in Switzerland. So the First World War, obviously, quite a big deal in the rest of Europe, but Switzerland managed to stay out of it. Even though the trench line, which ran all through the Western Front, ended at its border. And of course, the population was divided between French-speaking, German-speaking, so they had their own language loyalties. But Swiss neutrality held, and they weren't invaded, which I think is a big thing to point out, given what had gone on with the French 100 years before. But they weren't unaffected. There were food shortages, there were very high prices, and a lot more pressure for workers' rights. And one fascinating thing for me when I first arrived here was that you don't see many war memorials here. And the red poppy, which is a fact of life in November, if you live in Britain or France or Belgium, really means something. The commemoration here, it doesn't mean anything at all because the Swiss have nothing to commemorate because they weren't involved. But despite all that, November 1918 is actually a crucial date in Swiss history.
Yes, this came up over the anniversary a few years ago. It was the general strike.
Yes, the one and only in Swiss history. And again, not really the image you have of Switzerland of being a place where workers go on strike and the country comes to a stop. But it did for 3 days. And I think the most shocking aspect of it was that Swiss troops were actually used against civilians and people died as a result of being shot by the Swiss army. But it was over very quickly, and they came to a negotiated conclusion and a compromise. But the long-term results were actually quite important because it resulted in better working conditions, shorter working week, proportional representation in parliament, so more parties involved, and of course, just generally more political stability.
Mm-hmm. And thanks to all those war films, I think most people know that Switzerland was also neutral in World War II. And this was different from the First World War because this time Switzerland was completely surrounded by the Axis powers.
Yes, and I think it was a completely different dynamic for the Swiss. They were cut off. They had to survive alone. It's all very well being neutral when you're caught between the two sides, as they were in the First World War, but it's hard to be neutral when the other side is a long way away in Britain or America. And of course, this time around, the Germans did have invasion plans. It was called Operation Tannenbaum, and it was in the spring and autumn of 1940. Now, of course, we know it never happened. And the reason it never happened, lots of different theories. Believe what you want to believe. We won't go into that. But the Swiss response was something called the National Redoubt. They built huge fortresses under the mountains, and they were going to withdraw the army to those in the event of invasion, so abandon the cities and then resist at all costs from the mountains, which is quite a radical policy if you think about it. Let's abandon our population and fight from the mountains. Actually, have you ever been to one of the fortresses?
No, I haven't.
They're really fascinating. There's one up at the Gotthard Pass, there's one beside Lake Lucerne, and there's one beside Chateau Chillon on Lake Geneva. And you can see just how much was involved in housing hundreds of men under the mountains for years in the event of guerrilla warfare.
Yeah, it's just mind-boggling.
It is. And of course, the other lasting effect, which is often overlooked because of these amazing fortresses and the tank defenses you can still see in fields sometimes, they're little concrete triangles called the Toblerone line. Another lasting effect was there are lots of prisoners of war here from many, many different countries. And they were used as a labour force in farms and forests and helped building roads because a lot of the Swiss men were at the border, guarding the border. So the POWs did have a role to play, even though they were here peacefully.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if all the men were sent to the front line, to the fortresses, or if anybody stayed back to guard the city and women and children and so on.
That's a good question, actually. I think generally it was a little bit like, you remember from our childhood, a program called Dad's Army on British TV.
Oh, yes.
The Home Guard.
Very much
which
so.
Is the older men and the younger men and the slightly infirm and unable were the ones left behind. And because Switzerland has always had military service, the army was called up very, very quickly. And they were able to go to the border very quickly. And of course, the fortresses were built relatively quickly, but it took a few years. And luckily, it was never put to the test. It was almost like mutual deterrence. It's like, we invade you, you will, from the German side, from the Swiss side, well, you'll never get past us. We'll blow up our tunnels and bridges. And then what's the point? Because basically you're invading us for our tunnels under the mountains. So it was kind of mutual deterrence, and neither side gave in and neither side tested the other. But it was a very difficult time for the Swiss, not least because of food shortages, because they were cut off, but also because they had to deal with the enemy. The enemy surrounded them on all sides once France had fallen, and they had no choice really but to deal with the enemy. And that brought up a whole lot of problems.
And then, of course, there's the whole thorny issue about Jewish bank accounts and Nazi gold, but perhaps that's a little bit too heavy for us here today. Let's come back to the present and finish on a lighter note.
Yeah, I'm not sure the last point that we're going to talk about is that light. That's because it's the European Union.
No, that's definitely not light. So we're sticking with thorny issues after all. Sorry, guys.
I think the simplest answer is that Switzerland is not a member of the European Union and possibly isn't going to be one anytime soon.
Well, that sounds simple enough, but I sense a Swiss but coming.
Of course, there's a but. This but is that Switzerland is not a member, but it's almost one. There are over 100 bilateral treaties covering everything from free movement of people to access to the single market. That's why EU citizens can live here and Swiss citizens can live in the EU quite easily. And all of those treaties are the result of a very important vote in 1992. The Swiss government had applied to join the European Economic Area, which is kind of like a bigger version of the European Union if you're listening to this from outside Europe, as a first step to joining the EU. And it was a very, very close vote, and the Swiss people said no. So the whole of government policy was off course, and they had to find a different way to live with their big neighbour. And that became the bilateral treaties, each one of which has been approved by a referendum. So that's why Switzerland, for example, is part of Schengen, the visa-free travel zone in Europe, because the Swiss voted to join it. Now, of course, it's not an easy relationship. It's quite an unequal relationship, as the current talks show.
You mean the talks that the Swiss recently called off?
Yeah, the talks where no one's actually talking anymore. And again, it's a bit like mutual deterrence. Again, it's like who's going to blink first. And it's a really interesting point in Swiss politics, in Swiss history. We have to wait and see what happens. Could it be like Brexit, which becomes an eternal war of attrition? Or will the Swiss be more pragmatic? Will Brussels be more pragmatic? And will they find a solution?
Yep, we'll have to wait and see. Well, whatever happens, it will be interesting. And now that we're back in the present, it's time for our quiz question of the month, which is, how much does it cost to visit the Federal Parliament?
As always, we'll give you the answer next time. Until then, it's goodbye from us both.
Yes, this podcast was brought to you by Rütli. We're a staffing and IT services company based in Zurich.
And Diccon Bewes, best-selling author of Swiss Watching, amongst other books.
And thanks to you for listening. We'll include links in the show notes to our guest and to further materials about some of the topics that we've spoken about today. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Once again, this podcast was brought to you by Rütli. We're a staffing and project services company here in Zurich. If you would like our help either to hire or to be hired, let us know. Best way to do that is by going to rigby.ch/apply and filling out the form. You can also sign up for our newsletter at rigby.ch/newsletter to receive our Living in Switzerland guide. We'll send you one email per month about expat-focused news and jobs in Switzerland. So thanks, and until the next time.